Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast, AI and Architectural Design. Chapter 3, Prompt as Concept, Designing Before Designing. In the previous chapter, we examined how artificial intelligence makes design thinking visible, transforming what was once internal and implicit into a traceable sequence of decisions. The process, rather than remaining hidden behind final outputs, began to leave behind a record: prompts, iterations, selections, and revisions. Thinking became observable and therefore discussable. But once thinking becomes visible, another question inevitably follows. How is that thinking shaped from the very beginning? If the process can now be traced, then what initiates it? And more precisely, what is the role of the prompt in this emerging condition? In traditional architectural practice, the design process is often understood to begin with a concept. This concept is rarely a fully formed idea. It may emerge as a diagram, a word, a reference, or even a vague intention. It functions as a point of orientation rather than a final definition. The concept does not dictate the design, but it frames the direction in which the design will evolve. It establishes a territory of thinking. This early stage has always been somewhat elusive. Concepts are frequently presented retrospectively, refined into clear statements after the design has already taken shape. What appears as a coherent starting point is often the result of multiple iterations, adjustments, and reconsiderations. The origin of the idea remains blurred. The concept is both the beginning and a reconstruction of the beginning. With the introduction of artificial intelligence into the design process, this condition begins to shift. The prompt emerges as a new kind of starting point. Unlike traditional concepts, which may remain abstract or internal, the prompt requires articulation. It must be written, structured, and defined to generate a response. In this sense, the prompt forces the designer to externalize intention at the very outset. This externalization changes the nature of the beginning. Writing a prompt is not simply a technical step, it is a conceptual act. It defines parameters, establishes relationships, and frames expectations. It does not produce the design directly, but it sets the conditions under which the design will emerge. In this way, the prompt functions as a form of conceptualization before form-making begins. However, the prompt differs importantly from the traditional concept. A concept often seeks clarity and coherence. It attempts to stabilize an idea. The prompt, by contrast, operates within uncertainty. It is not a declaration, but a proposition. It invites variation rather than resolving it. The response it generates is not a confirmation, but a divergence. This introduces a fundamentally iterative dynamic. A prompt is rarely written once and left unchanged. It is adjusted, refined, expanded, and sometimes entirely reformulated. Each modification alters the trajectory of the process. The beginning is no longer a singular moment, but a continuous condition. Designing does not start once, it starts repeatedly. In this context, the distinction between thinking and making becomes less clear. Traditionally, thinking precedes making. The idea is formed, and then it is translated into form. With AI, this sequence becomes more entangled. The act of prompting produces immediate visual or spatial responses, which in turn influence further thinking. The process oscillates between articulation and generation. This oscillation has significant implications for authorship. If the initial direction is set by a prompt that generates multiple possibilities, the designer's role shifts from sole creator to active curator. The design is not produced in a single gesture, but emerges through selection, evaluation, and redirection. The author does not disappear, but the mode of authorship changes. The quality of the design process, therefore, becomes closely tied to the quality of the prompt. A vague prompt produces diffuse results. A precise prompt generates more focused responses. But precision does not mean rigidity. An overly constrained prompt may limit exploration, while an overly open one may lack direction. The challenge lies in finding a balance between clarity and openness. This balance is not purely technical, it is conceptual. To write an effective prompt requires an understanding of what is being sought, even if that understanding is provisional. It requires the ability to position references, define relationships, and anticipate possibilities. In other words, it requires design thinking before design takes form. At the same time, the prompt reveals another dimension of the design process: its dependency on language. Architecture has often been described as a visual or spatial discipline, but the act of prompting foregrounds its linguistic aspect. Words become instruments of design. Descriptions, adjectives, and associations shape the outcome. the boundary between writing and designing becomes increasingly porous. This does not reduce architecture to language, but it highlights the role that language has always played, often implicitly. Concepts have always been described, explained, and communicated through words. What changes is that language now directly generates form through interaction with AI systems. The translation from word to image becomes immediate. This immediacy introduces both opportunity and risk. On one hand, it allows for rapid exploration of ideas, enabling designers to test directions that might otherwise remain speculative. On the other hand, it may create an illusion of completeness. The presence of a generated image can be mistaken for a resolved idea. The process may appear more advanced than it actually is. This is where critical engagement becomes essential. The prompt is not an answer, it is a question. It does not conclude the process, it initiates it. The generated output must be read, interpreted, and evaluated. It must be situated within a broader conceptual framework. Without this critical layer, the process risks becoming superficial, driven by visual novelty rather than conceptual depth. The emergence of the prompt as a conceptual act also affects how design is taught. In the studio, students are often encouraged to develop a concept through sketches, diagrams, and references. With AI, prompting becomes part of this development. Students must learn not only how to draw or model, but how to articulate their ideas in a way that generates meaningful responses. This does not replace traditional skills, but it adds another layer to them. The ability to think spatially is complemented by the ability to think linguistically. The process becomes more hybrid, combining different modes of expression. The studio becomes a space where writing, drawing, and generating intersect. At a broader level, the shift from concept to prompt reflects a change in how beginnings are understood. The beginning is no longer a fixed point, but a field of possibilities. It is not defined once, but continuously negotiated. The design process becomes less about moving from idea to outcome and more about navigating a landscape of options. In this sense, the prompt does not replace the concept, it transforms it. The concept is no longer a static statement, but a dynamic process. It evolves through interaction, iteration, and reflection. It is constructed in dialogue rather than declared in isolation. This transformation does not simplify design thinking. On the contrary, it makes it more demanding. The designer must engage with multiple possibilities, evaluate them critically, and maintain a sense of direction within an open-ended process. The role becomes less about producing a single solution and more about guiding a sequence of decisions. If the previous chapter made thinking visible, this chapter begins to address how that thinking is initiated. The prompt becomes the first trace of intention, the first externalization of direction. It marks the point at which thinking begins to take form outside the mind. In the next chapter, we will move from the act of prompting to the tension it introduces within the design process, the balance between control and unpredictability. The discussion will shift from initiating ideas to negotiating them. Because once the process begins through prompts and responses, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who is actually in control of the design, and how does that control shift as the process unfolds? This concludes Chapter 3 of AI and Architectural Design, Prompt as Concept, Designing Before Designing. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.